proned out, handcuffed behind their back, that in no way, shape, or form is anything that is by policy, is not part of our training, and it is certainly not part of our ethics or our values.
Sir, based on your review of the
Doesn't mean
video
it's not
and based
used.
on your own experience and training as an MPD officer, did you see signs during the encounter that Mr. Floyd was exhibiting indicia of being in medical distress?
Definitely.
Yes.
Failing to render aid to Mr. Floyd.
I agree that the defendant violated our policy in terms of rendering aid.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor. If you could please take the
Mr. Nelson. Good man.
Good God, this audio.
So essentially what this policy 5-304 in terms of threatening the use of force, it's contained within this de-escalation concept, right? So sometimes you have to display a weapon to gain command so that you can de-escalate, right?
Yes.
Surprised he
When
agreed to
we're
that.
talking about, is it fair to say that pretty much every single one of these use of force of policies contains some phrase, if reasonable, or the use of force can be a de-escalation tactic?
That's so backwards thinking.
Counselor, I was thinking of your example of displaying your weapon, and so I don't have a lot of knowledge in terms of physical force being used to actually de-escalate a situation, but the threatening use of force or threatening verbally, I'm more familiar with that.
Okay. So again,
And he agreed to that,
talk to the use of force,
which is crazy.
Tactics.
Overruled.
Yeah,
would be the best
where?
source of that.
Overruled. Yes.
Prosecution's like, uh-oh.
The purpose of de-escalation.
De-escalation involves force. What?
Slow down or
Overruled, by the way, means the request failed.
Uncooperative subject. And so if officers decide to use the maximal restraint technique and then decide, hey, we know, and then later decide not to use it, right, that is kind of adjusting that use of force.
I would, Counselor, with some clarity, I don't know if that, what I mean by that is,
It's a bad question.
if you were to have a person handcuffed and prone on their stomach on the ground and pavement, and you had two officers, let's say, securing their legs to the back of the waist, you in a way are still employing what that technique is about anyway. So, so there can be some variances to that.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
It does. So let's assume that you've got two officers pulling the legs forward, essentially employing that aversion, so to speak, of the maximal restraint. But then they release and they say, we're not gonna hobble this person. We're not gonna employ the MRT. You're going from a decision to employ that technique backwards down the continuum in terms of the use of force. Would you agree with that?
And Counselor, I just because these types of uses of force can be problematic in terms of there's a high risk to them. So
Very problematic.
If you're going to take that initiative to do that alternative version in the first place, you'd want to get a hold of a supervisor because something could happen in terms of that person. And so
I'm not
yeah.
I'm not asking in terms of the policy. I'm asking in terms of sort of the use of force and the critical decision-making model, right? You described how the use of force, you have to go through this critical decision-making model. How much force am I going to use? And sometimes you have to back off the use of force. Agreed?
Yes.
And sometimes you have to go forward with the use of force, meaning you use even more force.
Yes.
Right? And it's this constant reevaluation, agreed?
Yes.
And so when you have officers who make a decision that the facts and circumstances would warrant using the hobble device, but then later decide not to employ that device, that is that critical decision-making model in action, agreed?
Yes.
And it would be a reduction in the use of force. It may still require supervisors to be on scene, policy-wise, but it is a reduction in the use of force. Agreed?
And Counselor, just, are we talking specifically the events of May 25th?
I'm talking
Oh,
generally.
In general, yes.
But you would agree, ultimately, that all of the Minneapolis Police Department policies relevant to the use of force, emergency medical response, emergency medical treatment, all of these policies are, by their very language, are situationally dependent, right? They all say if the circumstances allow, if time permits, if it's safe. They have a qualifier to them, agreed?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Defense is kind of floundering here, where he's not really getting anywhere at this point.
To show you Exhibit 2. People who observe, would you say that people who observe police interactions with people, especially the more physical or use of force types, that could turn into a crisis for an observer?
Sustainer is calling for speculation.
So in terms of
Right, I thought he was an
definition
expert
of
witness.
Crisis. A crisis may involve an
Is he a fact
individual's
witness?
perception or experience of an event.
That's crazy
or
if that's true.
situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds that individual's current resources and coping mechanisms, right?
Yes.
That doesn't necessarily mean that you are the person.
So an expert
with
witness is
whom
supposed
you
to testify
are arresting
not so much
or
to the
having
facts, but to
contact
opinion.
with is going to be the
Sometimes
person
both.
who will experience the crisis. Agreed?
Overruled.
Honestly, it seems like most of this is irrelevant. I think he's getting at.
Counselor, just respectfully, so you're saying that the person who's witnessing a situation with the officers, that situation may cause them to be in crisis?
Correct.
Could potentially.
Right.
What he's getting at is that
The
people don't
crisis may
understand
but
what's
not
going on.
necessarily result in an upward trajectory or intensity culminating in thoughts or acts that are possibly dangerous to him, her, or others. Right?
And Counselor, just, this is the person who's watching this?
Right.
It could?
So people are watching something that they appear to believe or they believe is wrong or contrary to police policy that may cause them to get upset, and that level of upsetment or that level of volatility may grow throughout the course of the interaction.
He's driving home. Come on. That's very relevant. Are you kidding me?
Overruled. It's within the scope.
Definitely within the scope.
It could.
Because ultimately,
Nice.
part of the training that Minneapolis police officers have to go through
Nailed it.
is how to deal with crowds who observe police interactions, right?
Yes.
You basically called the crowd
Crowds
idiots.
that may be upset with police interaction, right?
Yes.
Is it possible, generally speaking, that someone's own crisis may prevent them from hearing what an officer is telling them?
That could happen.
I think that was speculation.
Objection sustained. The answer will be stricken.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
So you testified that
Massive
you watched
speculation.
the body cameras.
He
correct?
can't know that.
Yes.
And speculation is when you ask them to testify to something they don't know. Like a hypothetical. Which is something only a expert witness should be able to do. And they need the proper information to make that analysis. Like the proper context.
Going to show you, I don't know,
So if he's not an expert witness, they've been allowing all kinds of opinion testimony from this witness.
Mr. Swisher, this is Exhibit 1008.
And based on these observations, do you have an opinion as to whether the defendant violated MPD Departmental Policy 7-350 by failing to render aid to Mr. Floyd.
I agree that the defendant violated our policy in terms of rendering aid.
This guy got worked. I don't think they should question him, but clearly they made something happen with it, so
2:30.
I'll give it up. Defense is a good way of making them say anything.